writers of the future, I really just have to go almost always with first-time authors. So that's actually the fun of it, because you know, the next time that we get another you know, J.K. Rowling or Stephenie Meyer coming through, I get to be the first to discover her. So I look forward to that.
Great.
Okay, we are at 7 o'clock, and I'm just going to keep on admitting people here. And we have Jonathan Mayberry with us, and would like to welcome Jonathan. Go ahead and silence your speakers, unless you want to scream out and have a dire impending question that that you want to ask. But I'd like to go ahead and just kind of get us rolling by introducing Jonathan. Jonathan, gosh, I'm trying to think. Jonathan has, I first got reading him back through the Joe Ledger novels, and I can't remember even how long ago it was, but I became an instant fan with the very first book that I read, and my wife read it, and so we're both Jonathan Mayberry fans now. Yeah, Jonathan has won a lot of awards in horror, and I thought of him first as a thriller writer. He's written extensively in comics and all sorts of things. And so what I typically like to do is just kind of go through and talk to the author a little bit about their career, how they got started, why they started the way that they did. And we have a lot of authors here, Jonathan, who are going indie. We have about 50% who are interested in traditional publishing. You are working a lot in the comic book arena, and I know that we have a couple of authors in here who are working in that too. So I'd just like to go ahead and let you talk a little bit about why you do what you do, what you enjoy the most, and we'll kind of go from there.
Well, David, thanks for inviting me here, and hello to everybody there. I recognize some of the faces here. So I had kind of a weird path when it comes to writing. I didn't start out to be the kind of writer I am. You know, I had this vision that I wanted to be either Woodward or Bernstein, because I was in high school shortly after Watergate, and I wanted to be the investigative reporter that broke the big story, and you know, and so on. Went to Temple University on a journalism scholarship with that in mind. And I think the only thing I haven't done in writing is actually work for a newspaper. About midway through college, I took a magazine feature class and got hooked on features. And I wound up started selling features while I was still in college. You know, the old write what you know thing. Well, I've been involved in martial arts since I was a little kid. So I started selling to the bigger martial arts magazines, and then moved on to writing all sorts of things. Wrote college textbooks, plays, greeting cards. In fact, if you remember those Hallmark cards with the cranky little old lady on them, the Maxine cards, I didn't create the character, but I did write the first 12 cards. Just a gig I saw in a magazine. They were looking for writers, and you know, decided to grab it. I've written how-to manuals for SWAT and Special Forces, a lot of martial arts books. And then in the late 1990s, early 2000s, I wrote my first textbook that was not related to either a college class that I'd been teaching or were directly related to martial arts. I did one on folklore, the folklore of supernatural monsters.
Some people are waiting to be added.
That is weird, because I'm not showing anybody waiting.
I just had a few people message me. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you, Jonathan.
Okay. So I had done a book on folklore just because I happen to love the subject matter, and while writing that, I kept thinking of how much I would like to see the folkloric versions of monsters in fiction, and I didn't know any writers who were doing that at the time, which was the early 2000s. So I just, on a lark, decided I was going to try a novel, and spent a couple of years writing that novel. Fell in love with the process of fiction, and that novel eventually, I landed an agent in 2004 She sold the novel in early 2005. It was published in 2006. And that was my first step into fiction. Now I'm writing another Joe Ledger novel, by the way, number 12 in that series. I am writing my 37th novel since 2004. And along the way, I got asked to just submit short stories for anthologies. Editors would reach out to me, kind of as David was mentioning earlier, that often an editor will go with writers that are established, because not only for the name value on the cover, even though at the time I was not a big name, but because they know that writer can read the guidelines, follow the guidelines, hit the deadline, won't get cranky with edits and so on. So I started doing a lot of short stories, and then I got to reach out from a comic book company to Marvel to start writing for them. So my career has kind of taken some weird turns. Fiction is where I live, and it's what makes me the happiest. And it's also even though I had all these visions of what would make me a successful writer, none of the things I did prior to fiction were successful enough for me to do that full time. I always had day jobs. I was a bodyguard. I was a jiu-jitsu master. I taught college, Temple University for 14 years, teaching martial arts history and women's self-defense. But when I switched to fiction, it turns out that's where my best skill set lay, and that's where the success was for me. And now I'm living in Southern California. I've got a bunch of stuff happening with film and TV, and I'm writing books and comics. And I didn't expect to ever be here, because this was never the light at the end of the tunnel for me in terms of where I wanted to go as a writer. So it's kind of an oddball career, but I found that a lot of writers follow oddball careers. There is not one guaranteed path that gets you there.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much true. I remember when I was young, when I would take jobs, I would take them because I thought they would be interesting someday. I'd be able to sit back as a writer and say, yeah, I was a prison guard and I was a missionary and I did this and I did that. And I think a lot of writers do that. I think a lot of us tend to get bored easily, I think, and we're always looking for some weird new experience.
The upside of that is some of those weird experiences make great, give you great insight for when you're writing. Like, I was a bodyguard for years, and I was a bouncer for years. So I've had a lot of conflict, a lot of fight situations, and that really informs a lot of how I write fight scenes in my stories. That said, I would like to go back and take my younger self, aside and smack him in the face a few times and say, don't do that job, because you're going to get stabbed, chopped, and shot at.
Yeah, when I was a prison guard, I used to work on the prison SWAT team. And in the prison SWAT team, I often did the exercises. We would have an exercise called Get the Animal Out of the Cell. And I was usually the animal. And then there was the next exercise was Get the Animal into his cell. And I was the animal. And I love fighting. I just love beating people up. We love getting hit. I don't know how, but when I read your work, I kind of get that thrill. I could see like, okay, here's somebody who's been in some real scrapes, and that's okay with me.
Yeah, I've probably been in between bouncer, bodyguard, and growing up in the area I grew up in, probably about 700 or 800 violent confrontations over the years.
Yeah.
Not something to be happy about, but it does give me good. It allows me to write fight scenes that are accurate rather than merely entertaining.
Yeah, there's a phase where you get into where you kind of look at everything almost as if you're outside your body and say, okay, this is how I'm going to take this person apart, and then you do it. And that's really all it comes down to. Whereas it's not all emotional for you. Anyway, you do really well. I've noticed you've been doing quite a few comics, and that you are also getting options on TV series. And do you find that you're getting a lot of options based upon your work in comics?
Yes, in kind of an indirect way. I did a series of comics and also shared world anthologies for IDW Publishing, and one of them was V-Wars, which was a science fiction take on vampires. And that became a Netflix show. We only had 1 year of it, though. Literally right now, the star of our show is in a meeting at this very moment with HBO Max to see if we can move it there. once once you have something of that kind of visibility, either a show in production or a show actually on the air, it makes you.
You had a calamity again in yourself.
During a little child. It tends
Mute
to
your
draw.
microphones, folks.
It tends to draw the eye a little bit from producers. So since that was first announced about 3 years ago, I've gotten a lot of reach outs from producers of various kinds. Sometimes they're on fishing expeditions. They don't have a specific thing in mind, like they don't necessarily want to adapt this comic or that book. They want to just see what your list of IPs are, intellectual properties. And I had one of those meetings on Friday via Zoom with a producer who wanted to go over some of my IPs because he's looking for something to do with a new movie format that may help Hollywood get back in traction after, even with the COVID thing going on. So the visibility comes from, from one measure of success. It tends to bring you to the next level. The question is whether you're willing to pivot with all the different changes and the different models for storytelling that they're interested in, because some of these are things that I had no experience in.
Yeah. I've noticed a few years ago, I had a fellow that I met who had 3 screenplays and they weren't selling, so he turned them all into graphic novels and went to the San Diego Comic-Con and sold all 3 movies, three movies based on them, and actually had them all produced.
Wow.
Just in a matter of like 6 months, he got the ball up and running. So I think it's a really great way to do it. And yet what's surprising to me is that you don't have to sell a whole lot of those comics in order to be successful.
No.
Because it's a visual medium, a lot of producers just relate to it really easy. It's like, oh, okay, this would look really great on film. I think I'll go ahead and buy it.
Well, one of the reasons is that a graphic novel or a comic, it's already storyboarded out. It looks like movie stills anyway. So it's much easier for them to see it and imagine what it will look like on the screen, and also get an idea of what kind of budget, whether it's a big budget or a modest production, indie production. By seeing the comic, it really helps them visualize what the show would be like. And often pages from the comic are used at pitch meetings in Hollywood. You say, all right, well, this is kind of what it looks like, and a lot of the concept art is straight pages from your book.
Yeah, I recently started adapting one of my novels to a comic format, and as I was doing it, I felt like, wow, I've got this great dialogue going on all over the place that needs to be chopped off. It felt like I was cutting off my arms and legs. So here's a question for you. When you're going through that process and you're trying to do that, if you've got a 400-page novel, what would you think you would end up coming with if you were trying to turn that into a graphic novel? What kind of page count would you be looking for?
Well, most graphic novels these days run from anywhere from like 170 to 240 printed pages. Now, it's not script pages, because script pages, there are more script pages than there are printed pages. Like, I just signed a contract with DC Comics to do an original graphic novel, not floppy comics, not individual comics, but a graphic novel. And it's 109, they want 190 pages for it. If I'm adapting one of my novels to comics, which I haven't yet done, by the way, I just wrote the pitch, the pilot script for an adaptation of one of my comics. And, reverse engineering from comic to script is easy, but from novel to comic is really tough, because you're going to lose so many things that you absolutely love. And that's really heartbreaking. I'm like, right now, one of my novels being adapted for film, and they have one of the screenwriters who worked on one of the bigger Marvel films adapting it. And he and I have conversations. He's had to cut out some of my favorite stuff, some of my favorite scenes and dialogues and characters. But as he pointed out, it's going to be a 2-hour movie, not going to be a 25-hour movie. And the novel was 110,000 words. There's just no way. So when I'm adapting, anytime I want to adapt something, I've got to go in there and look at, well, what scenes, really move the story along, and how many lines of dialogue truly need to be there. When I was first doing my comics, I'm like you, I love dialogue. So I had a lot of dialogue in my script, the comic book script, and I got a very polite note from the artist who said, I love your dialogue, man, but at some point, do you think the readers might want to see my art? So I had to go in and cut about 85% of my dialogue. The dialogue I loved, I had to cut it out. And I had to trust that the artist is going to use the visuals to continue telling and expanding that story, even if your words aren't always coming out of the characters' mouths or you're not having a bit of, narration with it. There's a lot of trust in comics because you're working with an editor who's very hands-on, the comic artist, sometimes there's a penciler and inker, the colorist and the letterer all have input into this. And it's a wise writer who listens to that input rather than tries to, be precious about everything they've written and say, it's my way or the highway. That doesn't play in comics. It's very much a team effort.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go through and look at some of the questions we have. I didn't want to take my eyes off of one screen here for a little bit, but let's just go through a few questions that people have, and then we'll see where we're at here. This is Mike Wyatt asks, Davis mentioned you have experience working on graphic novels. What is the best process for going for traditional publishing in that area? And if it's a bad idea, what would you recommend?
Well, boy, the answer for that is different now than it was before COVID, because one of the best ways prior to this was to go to a big Comic-Con like San Diego, New York, Emerald City. One of the Comic-Cons where you have people, we have booths from the comic companies, because often editors or assistant editors are manning those booths. And probably 70% of the pitches that they take are taken at Comic-Cons. Nowadays, that's changed. And at this moment, pitching to comic companies is really a bad idea. I mean, Marvel has cut its entire line down by 40%. A lot of DC Comics writers have been told pencils down because the company that delivers the comics to comic book stores, Diamond Distributors, is not doing that right now. And there is no plan B to get comics from the publisher to the comic book store. This will pass eventually. Pitches will be taken online, and they'll move to a more online model as time goes on. So the easiest way is to go to the comic book company webpage and look for the guidelines. Almost every one of them has submission guidelines. Now, sometimes there's a form that you have to fill out. Like Marvel has a very specific form, and so does AWA and say Image and a few others, where if you're pitching to them, you have to sign a form saying that this is understood that there is no obligation for them to buy anything. Because in the past, there's been weird litigation by people who say, oh, I gave it to them and they said no, but then they did the same comic with someone else. And that's generally not the case. So you have to sign the form and then you submit your pitch. And there's different forms of pitching. Side note, by the way, on my website, jonathanmayberry.com, and spell my name right, it's M-A-B, there's a page called Free Stuff for Writers. There's a sample of a comic book script. I think there's a comic book pitch up there. So they're downloadable PDFs. Just go grab what you need to see what the form looks like. But right now, pitching to the companies through their websites is a good idea. The second best way to do it is to reach out to a writer who's in the industry and ask if they can make a connection for you. And that's probably going to be right now the dominant way for the next 6 months to a year, and then it'll fall back to website submissions, and then eventually go back to in-person pitches at conferences.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. People that I've known who've gone in as indies, have gone in and created their own comics. And even they'll go down to San Diego Comic-Con, and instead of getting a booth, they'll just walk around with a coat with their comics, and pass them out to producers, and that has worked too. But with that closed down, that makes it so that you really don't have much of a way to get to those big to the big producers.
One thing, the comics industry, of all the areas of publishing, the comics industry is the most hard hit right now because of the distribution issue. I mean, the actual production of the comics can happen virtually. I'm still working on stuff with comic book companies right now, but the actual delay and the actual getting it to the comic book stores is becoming problematic. And it's going to wind up killing a lot of comic book stores, and you're going to see a lot of direct-to-consumer sales from the publishers or for independent comic producers.
Yeah. And I've seen people who've succeeded. I've got a friend who picked up hundreds of thousands of fans just by doing a comic or a webzine on comics too. So
yeah.
You know, there are independent ways to get into this business, I guess is the easy way to put it.
Yeah, a lot of web comics are really popular, and they tend to be a lot less expensive to produce because there's no printing, there's no shipping, the overhead is not there. It's a virtual business. Another way of doing something like that would be a Kickstarter program. You know, creating your own product that way. And in fact, some of the existing comic book companies do Kickstarters. I'm about to do one. There's a company called Clover Press. It's a small press in Del Mar, California, run by the guy who originally founded IDW Comics. And he wants me to adapt a Wizard of Oz short story that I had written and into a graphic novel. And they're going to do a Kickstarter for it because with COVID hitting the industry, it's very difficult to finance something like that, especially for a small company. But a Kickstarter, you know, that does everything. And then they'll, of course, be able to print it and ship it themselves directly to the people who fund the Kickstarter. And it bypasses the distribution issue.
Yeah, that makes great sense. Kickstarter, particularly if you're doing something like a comic, it gives you, you know, possibly, you know, you've got your first edition, you may have a second edition that comes out and things like that. And you can build on your audience really well. And so these guys are doing a great job of learning how to monetize their Kickstarters and really get things going. So that makes good sense. So here's a question from Wolf Moon, who asks, as editor for Weird Tales magazine, can you tell us your idea of what weird is? I've got a story. Dave gave a silver honorable mention to it, Writers of the Future, and I've gotten several great story not right for us personals from the prozines. So how weird is weird at your magazine? Can you define something so nebulous?
Weird Tales has been around for nearly a century in various incarnations. Nobody has accurately defined what weird is. Generally, if you're getting it's not right for us, you may be in the right zip code for Weird Tales. Things like swords and sorcery were invented there because there had been adventure tales. There had been horror tales, but horror adventure tales were kind of new in fiction in the 20s and 30s. So things like Conan and Jarrell of Jewry and some of those others, that was the home for them. Cosmic horror that H.P. Lovecraft created, and other people have done, you know, even better versions than he did. It wasn't straight horror because cosmic horror is technically science fiction because it's an alien race that's evolved to a level of power similar to godhood. So it's technically science fiction, but it's monsters, and it's written as horror story. So it's generally a mishmash of different genres: science fiction, some mystery. There's a lot of paranormal investigators. Seabury Quinn did a whole bunch of paranormal investigator stories for the early Weird Tales. It can be science fiction, it can be horror, it can be thriller, but it's usually a mix of all three with a bias towards something deeply disturbing. And that's about as close to a definition as we can get for that.
Yeah, I like that. I think that what it comes down to probably is that the editor has to love it and say, yeah, I don't know what the devil this is, but it fits the definition of being weird.
Yeah, I mean, as an editor, if I can read a story, and right now I'm going through this mile-high slush pile, if I read a story and I can see that it belongs in like an Asimov or a FNSF or Shock Totem or some other magazine where it's a fairly clearly defined genre, then I know it's not right for us. Because I've gotten some stories that are pretty, you know, dark, but they're really science fiction, or they're really thriller, or they're really this. It's when I can't think of any other place where it could be published is when I start thinking it might be in the pile of stories I want to take a little more seriously.
Okay. For some reason, our website is having some problems for the Apex calls. Folks, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please go ahead and unmute your speaker and ask it. I think maybe that might be a little bit easier for you because I don't know why, but the website just went down. So I can ask questions all day. So let's go ahead and give you 10 seconds. Next question.
Jonathan, it's AJ. I was wondering, looking at post-pandemic, where do you think we're going with traditional publishing versus small press, indie? Kind of what changes do you think are going to happen?
Indie is probably going to expand, and because it's been expanding ever since the economic downturn of 2008 and 9. Indie is expanding because also, you know, we're having right now one of the things we had back then where a lot of the people in traditional publishing are losing their jobs. Editors, proofreaders, copy editors, structural editors, designers, cover artists. A lot of them are no longer, you know, employed, or they've been cut back, or they're on unemployment. They're looking for work, which means you can afford these pros to come in and help you fine tune your indie work so that when it comes out, it stands up as a really strongly well developed, well designed, and totally professional reading and looking book. And that's what we start seeing in 2008 and 9, and we're seeing it, definitely starting to see it now too. So I think indie's going to do fine. Micro press and small press, it depends on what their distribution is. If they have a strong ebook presence, they're going to be doing okay. If they rely on brick and mortar bookstores, they're not going to be doing okay for a while because that's a problem. That's why some of the bigger houses are taking a hit, because they really do rely on brick and mortar. If they can go into, if it's indie or small press and they can go into the audio space, they're going to do great. Audio is exploding right now. In fact, I'm working right now on, I just finished my first of 3 novellas I'm doing for Audible. And, you know, Audible's exploding because everybody's at home and they got to do something, so they're listening to audiobooks. So that's doing great. Any part of publishing that relies on people going to a bookstore, that's where the damage is. That's where we're seeing the damage. And that's going to continue until people feel safe and confident, not just small groups, but everyone feels safe and confident going to the bookstores. Things like Barnes & Noble and most independent bookstores do not have good game when it comes to mail order. Some do. Like my local bookstore, Mysterious Galaxy in San Diego, they're great at mail order. So they're doing okay, and they have a good social media game too. They know how to reach the people and cultivate things, online workshops, online book signings. Whether it's indie, small medium press, or big house, anyone that has good social media performance is also going to do well. But the old traditional model of a book, you know, you have to go to a bookstore to get a book, that's going to take a hit, and that's not going to recover very quickly.
Okay, I've got some my website's back up, so I'm going to ask you some questions. Martin Shoemaker asks, 47th North is releasing a book 2 in my series in October. I have a number of NetGalley eARC codes to distribute. How do I use those most effectively? You once mentioned sending eARCs to reviewers. I think that might actually have been me who mentioned that, who liked earlier books in the series, but book 1 had only 1 professional review. And I'm certainly sending a code to that reviewer. Thanks.
One of the best things to do there is reviewers are good, bloggers are better, especially bloggers who do podcasts. And there's a ton of them out there. Just search on your genre and the word podcast or book podcast, you'll find tons of them. You might need to give them ER codes for both first and second book if they're interested, so they can catch up, or have a really good synopsis of the first book so they can read the second for review purposes and not feel lost. That works really well, actually. Also relying on fan reads and fan reviews. If you have people who really liked the first book, they don't have to be professional reviewers, but if they have a good social media presence, that can sometimes be just as important. Like, for example, I don't subscribe to, say, the San Francisco Chronicle, right? And I know they do a lot of great book reviews, but I don't read them because I don't subscribe to that. But I do look for book reviews on the net. So if I have links. If I want reviews that are going to matter to me, I'm going to be looking for people whose reviews are all over the net. They don't have to be top of the game. They just have to be consistent with cross-platform presence. So when they do a review, if it shows up on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Goodreads, well, I don't care if they're not, a top name newspaper or a top reviewer. They're getting traction. They're getting noticed. I want that person to be reading my stuff. So scroll around a little bit to look for reviewers who are, maybe just totally independent. There are more independent reviewers than there are professional reviewers these days. And, offering them books, offering them to maybe do an appearance on their podcast as a guest, that sort of thing is great for them. And that makes it great for you. Oh, one other thing with that too. It's not a bad idea, since we have things like Zoom, Facebook Live, and other things, to find another writer in your genre who has a book out or maybe a book coming out, and do an event together online, share it, so that you draw in both fan bases, because you can wind up selling a couple of books, or if there's three books. I've done quite a few of those, and it winds up getting really nice cross-pollination between the audiences following different writers. They become one big shared audience. My friends Scott Sigler, Peter Kleins, and I do a lot of events together, and as a result, we draw a pretty big crowd. So.
Yeah, we've been talking about forming writers' rings in here. That's exactly what I'm talking about with writers' rings, is basically cross-pollinating our audiences and doing it in a good way. Apparently, there is a method of doing writers' rings that's sort of a black hat kind of way, where you're borderline illegal and you're going to get yourself in trouble. Don't do that. I'm totally white hat on everything I do, guys. So,
and also with that, David, some people think that in order to promote your book, you need to slam the competition's book. And that's exactly the opposite. Praise the competition, because their readers, for example, James Rollins, he's the top writer in the weird science genre my Joe Ledger books are in. He's the top of the game. I praise his books whenever they come out, partly because I love the books, partly because Jim and I have become friends, but also he puts out one book in that Sigma 4 series a year. People will read it in 3 or 4 days. That leaves a heck of a lot of days where they're looking for something else of the same flavor. Well, my books are the same flavor. If Jim and I are cross-promoting, then the people who want to stay in that genre zone just know, well, hey, this guy's, he and Jim are friends, or he and Wes Oakes are friends. Maybe I'll go read his stuff too. You get a lot more traction, a lot more followers, a lot more success when your business model is about sharing and fun rather than kicking somebody else.
Absolutely. Okay, Aisley Oliphant asks, how do you write an emotionally impactful death scene? What details do you use for maximum potency?
Good question. It depends on the type of story. Usually, I'll build in the importance of that character to other characters and to the world. Like, for example, in my Rotten Ruins series, there's a character who dies in the second book. He's been very influential and very important to the main character all through those stories, and he's heroic. He's the kind of character that he's so important to the story, you can't imagine the story going further without him. So his death, as he's dying, the characters are not only grieving for the loss of a friend or a relative, they're also terrified by the fact that they have to go on without this person. The person, their death is going to leave a hole in the world in the shape of that person, and nothing's going to be able to fill it. So there is no clear view forward of how the character is going to go and survive this without this character. So personal stakes really matter. Also, if you get inside the head of the character who's dying a little bit, maybe somebody shifts their point of view, the loss of everything they've ever known. A lot of people have beliefs about what's coming next, but very few people, I don't know anyone who actually knows for sure what's coming next. So that moment of terror when they're losing everything they know, and they're losing connection with the people they love, from both sides of the death, that becomes really important. It should never just be stunt casting or stunt death, just there to spice up a scene. It should have emotional stakes that not only are impactful in the moment, but that echo through the rest of the book. That person should not be dead and forgotten. That person, every other character is going to drag along with them some wreckage, personal, emotional wreckage as a result of that death. So it's something you plan well and think through, and don't be afraid to break your own heart when doing it. When I wrote that death scene in that young adult novel, I was sitting in a Starbucks, I had tears streaming down my face writing the scene because that character mattered to me too. And if you put that much of your heart in there, it's going to break the hearts of the readers. Great question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think I always think back to Gandalf when I was 17 years old reading
Good Lord.
Lord of the Rings and just how he felt like there was a gaping hole there that couldn't be filled anymore. You know, that's the kind of character you want to create, and you want the reader to fall in love with that character. And the only way to make the reader fall in love with the character is to fall in love with the character yourself, to build somebody that you personally care about, I think. So
it's interesting. When I read Harry Potter, Snape's death really got me. Because I had been, even though before I knew that he was really secretly a good guy, I'd had a suspicion because there were too many times when he's actually protecting the kids, he could do them damage with nobody looking. His death ruined me for days. I was a mess.
Yep, that was a good one. Okay, Brenda asked the question, I'm really excited about learning more about scenes of compressed action, such as fight scenes and chase scenes. How do you encapsulate the sensory elements and tension of such scenes without too much description? How do you choose just the right action to fit character motivation and turning point?
Well, my trick has always been to overwrite the scene and then pare it back. If I try to be too careful in writing the scene, it can actually have a little bit of a stilted feel to it. So I tend to overwrite the scene. I put a lot of exposition in there. I explain a lot of what's going on. And then I go in and I chop out a ton of it, leaving only that which absolutely needs to be there. And I found that to be a really smooth, easy method. But the best fight scenes I have ever read are in the Travis McGee novels by John D. MacDonald. His fight scenes are brilliant. They're absolutely brilliant. And nothing has been a stronger influence on my own fight scenes than those in terms of literary fight scenes. Because he actually explains some things while the fight scene's going on, and it never slows down the pace. In fact, what it does, it whets the appetite and sharpens the expectation for what's happening, so that as it happens, we understand more of the physical and psychological and emotional impact of it. Reading the fight scenes in the Travis McGee books it's a master class in how to write a fight scene. And I teach writing fight scenes. I actually quote or reference those fight scenes quite often because nobody has done it better. And the scenes, one of the really crucial things about what John D. MacDonald did and what a few other good writers have done is a fight scene should not be an oasis of action in the middle of a narrative. It should be the fuel that drives the narrative forward. If the fight scene is not driving the narrative forward, it's just a waste of space. It's cotton candy. But if a fight scene is driving the narrative forward, that fight scene becomes crucial to understanding the entire book. So every little detail in there, in the final draft of it, has to be that fuel that drives that scene forward. And sometimes revising a fight scene down to that after you've overwritten it is one of the more difficult, but also one of the more rewarding parts of revision, because if you can do that, there's no other revision element that is going to be as much of a challenge. So, you know, you're teaching yourself how to write your best scenes that way.
Yeah, good advice. Okay, so here's a question for you. Stephenie Talent, and this is just, I'm asking this one because it's related, says, I'm really wanting to take one of your writing fight scenes classes, but can't attend this upcoming one. I'll be at work. Is it recorded as well? Thank you.
Sorry you can't attend this one. No, it's not recorded, but I do them about every other month. So I'll be doing another one. Probably, this one's in June. I think the next one will probably be in August, but I'll keep doing it. I actually don't like recording my lectures or my workshops because I prefer them to be organic, because as the workshop unfolds, new information may come up, questions may happen, and so on. I prefer it to be organic. So no, it's not going to be recorded, but I will do this. This is actually the second time I'm doing it just since the last couple of months. So there'll be one in August and probably one in October, November.
Yeah.
By the way, just a side note about that. All the proceeds from those workshops, I have a fun thing I do with proceeds. Every other workshop either goes to, like, one will go to women's shelters, the other will go to homeless shelters, or providing some services like support services for essential workers. So every single workshop has some benefit. I don't actually, use the money. I use it for that. So, we're actually fighting need out there too with the workshop. So it's kind of fun to do it that way.
Yeah, yeah. I find that before I ever record a workshop, I want to teach it half a dozen times, because so often you learn so many things about the topic, about what audiences need to know. Things come out organically that you wouldn't have thought of the first time. So you really have to do that, I think.
Yeah.
So here's another question for you. This is kind of broad, and I'm almost feel like I'm opening the floodgates. What do you know about self-publishing comic books? I think she's thinking about self-publishing a comic book, and maybe it looks like a little advice on how to do that.
Well, I'm probably not the guy to answer that question, though, because I've never self-published anything. Everything I've done is traditional published. The closest I'm coming to it would be the Kickstarter program, but it's actually funded. It's sponsored by or in conjunction with an actual company. So I haven't really done it. I know from friends who have self-published that most of them have done it successfully, starting with a web comic and doing limited print runs of their books. And most of those print runs are to give out to editors, to reviewers, and so on. But that's really as far as my knowledge of self-publishing comics goes. Sadly, I wish I could give you a more complete answer, but it's really not the area that I'm an expert in.
Yeah, it's that's actually a good answer. I know a bunch of people who've self-published comic books, and there is so much to it. But you're absolutely right. I think starting out on the web is a great way to do it. Self-publishing and doing limited runs to give out to editors and things like that is definitely the way to go. But there gets to be so much more to it. There's strategies involved in how many pages are going to be in the comic book, how many comic books you're going to put together to create a graphic novel and that type of thing. So it gets pretty complex. You almost need to sit down and work with a comic book artist who's done it a couple of times. In fact, I have an idea for a guest speaker I'll bring on here in the next week or two, who can talk with us about that. Okay. So here's a question. I like this question. Mike Wyatt asks, what is the secret handshake someone needs to know to get hired at Marvel?
Yeah, that's a toughie. Here's the thing about Marvel. I got involved in Marvel in 2008, late 2008, and my agent and I had been planning on how to pitch to Marvel. We'd come up with all sorts of ideas for what our first pitch would be, and working on how to approach Axel Alonso, who was the editor-in-chief, wondering if maybe we should go through one of the editors on a tier down. And then Axel Alonso just called me out of the blue. He'd read my novel Patient Zero, bought an airplane in an airport because he'd forgotten his Kindle. And he liked Patient Zero and called me up and just asked me to write for Marvel. So I never actually had to pitch for them. I was also brought on in the phase when Marvel was looking for mostly novelists to write comics. David Morrell, myself, Victor Gischler, and a few others who are novelists, David Liss, were brought on because we could handle more compressed storylines, because that was the time, that was the point at which comics were moving from the ongoing issues to each title would have a limited arc. So a story might be anywhere from 4 to 6 issue arc, because that would then be collected into what's known as a trade. A trade is different from a graphic novel. Graphic novels are original material. A trade is when it's collected issues published in book form. So they were looking for novels because that collected arc of 4 to 6 issues is approximately the same amount of storytelling that would go into a novel. Right now, Marvel has has the thing on this website to pitch, but I know for a fact they're not taking pitches right now. The industry is in trouble right now, and they're not taking pitches. The only way to really get to an editor rate these days, and I wish I had known this sooner, is actually through your literary agent. And if you don't have a literary agent, then the next best thing is wait for the comic book companies to come, for the plague to be over so people can go to comic conventions. Because in person, you know, is the third best method. There is no secret handshake. It's either connections, submission through their guidelines, or meeting them in person. That's pretty much it.
I used to have an old friend, Julius Schwartz, who was an editor at DC, and he answered that question this way. He says the easy answer to that is this. He says, you go out, you start your own comic book company, you get rich and famous, and then we'll hire you. And basically, he said, you know, it's a job that guaranteed. They'd started wages there at $120,000 a year, and he says nobody ever retires, nobody quits, you know, from this job. It's so, you know, they use the golden handcuff method of retaining employees, and so it became a matter of you just really have to go out and make it on your own, and that is the secret handshake, you know. I think that's good advice.
I thought of one more, David. So sorry to interrupt. I thought of one more that yeah. It's a long game, but it works a bit. If you know, there are many tiers to the comic book world. Starting with one of the lower tiers and pitching to them, and again, go through their website because they do have the submission guidelines. It might be something where your page rate's not much. It might be as low as, you know, $20 a page, or maybe even a percentage of profits. But if that book comes out and gets any kind of decent reviews, or, you know, either good reviews or good sales or both, and sales numbers relative to that level of publishing, then you can use that as your calling card. But that is a long game, and that could be years before you get there.
I don't know much about comic book sales nowadays. I created a comic a few years ago, back in 1990, 30 years ago. And we hit number 3 on the bestseller list in comics. But I think there were only something around the neighborhood of 30,000 comics. And we were number 2 behind Superman, or we were just behind Superman and Batman. Wow. With that comic. I don't know if the numbers are still that low, but it surprised me because I'd had novels that had sold 1 million copies. And yet comic books carry so much more weight with producers, you know.
Yeah, well, the most successful movies we've had recently are comic book movies.
Yeah.
So we know that that's a successful model, so everybody wants to grab them either for movies or for TV shows like The Boys, Garth Ennis show on Netflix, and there are tons of others. The model's been proven to make a smooth transition, not just with superheroic comics, but things like History of Violence and V for Vendetta and Ghost World and others. You know, some of which were indie comics before they became movies or TV shows. That model really works. It's a very successful model. But it is, you know, breaking in, it's funny, we can talk about all the different ways of breaking in, but I've been on panels with, you know, industry pros. Not one of us broke in a normal way. It's always been some weirdo thing that happened, and, you know, suddenly you're in. So I guess one of the things is be visible. You know,
yeah.
You can't get hit by a car if you're not playing in traffic. So, you know, be visible and talk about comics on social media a lot. Talk about how you want to write comics or are writing comics. People who love comics read a lot of posts. They follow hashtags about comics, and they'll find you. You know, so keep posting, keep talking positively about them. If you're up there, if you're doing straight reviews, as much as you might want to be a reviewer, if you're slamming anyone's comic, you are making enemies in the business. It's not the time to make enemies in the business. Talk positively, or find something else to say.
Yeah. Udi Kumar asks, one of the tricks for thriller writing is that I've been taught is to have shorter chapters, most of which end with some sort of a hook or a cliffhanger so that the reader feels that they can't put the book down, and that they feel like they're tearing through the story really quickly. Are there any other techniques or tips that you have that are specific to thriller writing?
Well, first off, that chapter thing is absolutely correct. Dan Brown borrowed that from the pulps, and it really works for all of us in the thriller field. But one of the things that matters the most in thrillers is no matter how bizarre your thriller is, if you're doing a weird science or action thriller, make sure that your nonfiction backstory is rock solid. So if you're writing a legal thriller, make sure you really understand the law and find those elements of the law that are real but quirky, because that becomes your hook, your the thing that's going to make your story stand out. For me, I read a lot of weird science thrillers, so I talk to experts all the time. Just this afternoon, I was actually on the phone with my molecular biologist friend, who is helping me with the current novel I'm doing. No matter how much you may think you know about a subject, unless you're a scientist, you don't know what's going on in the science right now. So I asked, not only do I ask these guys for advice on what I expect the story to be, I ask them questions like, what don't I know enough about your field to even ask you? And also, what's the weirdest or most interesting thing happening in your field right now? Every single person, no matter what field they're in, has some interesting story to tell about their field of expertise. Cops, EMTs, scientists, soldiers, real estate agents, you name it. They'll know something. They'll have some polished story. The stories they'll tell at parties, for example. And those things are gems because they're telling them because they're interesting and because they're pretty sure nobody they're going to tell it to already understands or knows that. It's a quirky thing. Well, that's the sort of thing that can help us, help form the core of our story or add to it. But the more research you do on the nonfiction backstory of your thriller, the more of a strong foundation the thriller will have. And that advice is even more important when you are putting a foot over the line into, say, science fiction. There's an old saying, old con man saying, use 9 truths to sell 1 lie. If you build your story with a lot of nonfiction, solid nonfiction information, it's going to be harder for the reader to know when you've taken that step off into the fantastic. And therefore, it's easier for them to have suspension of disbelief and to emotionally buy into the structure of the thriller.
Okay. I have a question here from Udi Kumra, I think it was. Let's see. Lost it here for just a second. Sorry about that. He asks, this isn't from Udi. This is from Brendan Harvey. He says, where do I start reading the author, Jonathan Mayberry? How would you recommend people start out with you?
Well, I would always direct you at one of 3 novels. My 2 most popular novels are the first ones in 2 different series. The Joe Ledger novel, the Joe Ledger series, the first book is Patient Zero. It's a science fiction take on a kind of a zombie bioweapon, but it's not truly a zombie story. It's a prion disease story. But it's fun because it plays with different models of storytelling. It alternates between first and third point of view. Every time the main character is on screen or on the page, it's his point of view, and it's very snarky and very emotional, deep point of view. But anytime he's not in the scene, it's another third person point of view, and sometimes that's omniscient, sometimes not. And it's a fun series. I'm writing the 12th book in the series right now. The second book I'd recommend is Rotten Ruin if you're into post-apocalyptic science fiction mostly for teens. That book is required reading in hundreds of schools, thousands of schools around the world, and is in development for film. It's also being adapted as a webtoon, which are comics formatted for your cell phone, and it's enormously popular. We've got, I forget how many hundreds of thousands of people subscribing to it already. And the third book is my personal favorite book I've ever written. It's Glimpse. It's a standalone suspense horror that I think is my vote, for my own work as my best. I really love the book. So any one of those 3 would be a great place to start.
Okay, I have a personal question for you. With the book with Pandemica, you worked with an author or with an illustrator, Alex Sanchez. A couple of years ago, I was looking at some comics and I was really impressed by his artistic ability. How did you get to work with him?
Well, one of the things about the comic industry, especially the top couple of tiers, is the writer rarely gets to pick the artist. The editor is usually the one who, once you've done a pitch, starts thinking about, well, which artist do we really think fits? And often there's a discussion where the editor will send lots of samples. At the same time, you as the writer can make your own suggestions. It will come down to whether that person is available and whether that person fits the budget for the comic. Every comic gets given a budget. So for example, when I was working for Marvel I was writing Black Panther for 2 years. I had Scott Eaton and then, Ken Lashley first and then Scott Eaton to work with. Ken had been working with a previous writer, Reginald Hudlin, and we just wanted to finish off the storyline that Reggie started and I completed. But Ken's a fantastic artist, but he's slow. You know, he's really detailed and very slow. Scott is incredibly fast for all the detailed work he did. So when we knew that Ken was leaving, you know, I made up a list of artists that I liked, gave it to my editor, and we compared notes. And the one name that was on both lists was Scott Eaton. So it worked out really well. With Alex Sanchez, the editor, when I pitched Pandemica to IDW, my editor there, David Hedgecock, said, all right, I've got 5 artists I think you might like. Here are their links. Tell me what you think. Alex was the third person on the list, and I absolutely fell in love with the acting. When the artist draws a character's expressions, it's called acting. His ability to have the characters act really sold me, because even though it was a science fiction action comic, there's a lot of emotional, subtle emotional elements to it. And I thought he really nailed it. So we talked about it, and he was a little more expensive than the budget they had allowed, but they thought, you know, we agreed that he would bring the kind of game that would sell extra copies. And as a result, I mean, we sold out every issue of the comic. Little, by the way, side note about Pandemica. It's a 5-issue run. 4 issues came out. The 5th issue has not yet come out because of the global pandemic. So the Pandemica comic is, but they're going to put out the trade collection of all 5 issues in June. But because Diamond Distributors is not back in business to take the individual comics to the comic book store, the 5th issue won't be out until July. That sounds insane to me. And I just found this out about an hour and a half ago, and I'm still like, so the complete trade will be out before the last issue. Interesting. But yeah, Alex Sanchez is amazing. And this is Pandemica. His art is just incredible. It's just amazing.
I think I saw that it was out on June 1st was supposed to be the issue day.
Yeah, the trade, yes.
Yeah, okay. I looked at that and I thought, oh, that's not very far away. That sounds, I'm going to go save my, it's just after my birthday too, so I know what I could do with my money.
Your birthday's then, my birthday was yesterday, so happy birthday to both of us.
There we go. Okay, here's a question, motivation. Just one last question, I think. NJ asks, I feel like the 4 walls of being in quarantine have been transposed into being 4 walls in my mind. My attention span has gone down, and if I'm not watching a movie, chatting online, and going through social media all at the same time, then I'm bored. I'm an avid reader, but haven't read in don't know how long since all this started. Needless to say, trying to get into my own mind long enough to put words on a page is not happening. My weekly writers group check-ins feel like massive failures. I don't know what to do or how to get past this hole while the world continues to be shut down. Any advice?
I got plenty of advice on that. First off, as far as the reading part goes, switch to audiobooks while you're walking. The endorphins will kick in as you're walking, brings your optimism and excitement, and you'll have the story playing in your head. Listening to the story will also kind of kick in your creative juices, because when you hear a story well written and well told, you really do get a desire to, if you're a writer, to go out and write. That's part one. Second, even though, you know, I'm working from home right now and my office is next to my bedroom, I can just walk 4 feet and I'm here. I still get up, take a shower, get dressed every day, and come to my office, and I set I have one of those Echo devices. I set my timer for 50 minutes. I do 50 minutes of writing in a sprint, 10 minutes of social media, 50 minutes, 10 minutes, but I have my alarm go off to tell me when to work. I don't care if what I write is crap. All that matters is I get it down on the page, because I can always fix it later. That's what revision's for. But every day I need to advance something. And I also bribe myself pretty heavily. So, because I went through some of the malaise when this started too, even though I normally work from home. So every day that I hit my word count, I would go to iTunes and buy myself a movie every day. You know, I now have a lot of movies.
Okay.
And the word count I set, by the way, like I typically write 4,000 words a day. I'm a high output writer, but I set my word count at 2,500. So when I hit 2,500, I do two things. I go to iTunes and buy a movie, and I go to my online bank and I put money in a vacation account every day. So I am paying myself every day. I get addicted to those rewards. It's a Pavlovian response. I want the movie and I want the money. And if I miss a day, all of the money has to come out of the vacation account, every single penny of it. It has to go to bills or something else. So there's motivation. I'm not about bribing myself. Also, doing your writing sprints with someone else keeps you honest. I have a couple of folks that every morning, 10 o'clock every morning, the three of us do 1 hour of writing together. And in the end, we compare notes. And we also have to cut and paste what we wrote that day to show each other that we actually did that. And every day we move the needle. Today, in that first hour sprint, I did 586 words. Felt really sporty about it. The others did about the same. And we've been doing it 5 days a week for about a month and a half now. And it really does help us move forward because we know somebody else is counting on us as their support, just as we are, as they are our support. Those things help. Not being alone in isolation is key. You know, if you're going to go on social media not to read the news, but post something funny, read something funny, say hi to folks who are shut in, makes you feel better about yourself. Also, it makes you feel better about the community. The sprints, I even use sometimes an actual hourglass. I'll turn it over and I'm not allowed to go to social media or a website or go to YouTube and watch 1980s rock videos, which I love to do. Can't do any of that until that hour is done. So all of these things are little incentives. I get dressed for work. I go to work on time. I have a schedule. I have partners, which I consider to be fellow employees in the next cubicle, even if their cubicle is in another state. All of these little things help. And what happens is once you get back into that routine, it becomes easier to stay in the routine. Routine, instead of becoming, you're trapped at home, you're comforted by the routine because the routine is moving you forward. You're starting to feel that sense of accomplishment. And eventually, you're back to having fun again as a writer. Those things really help.
Great advice. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, folks, it's 8:03. We do nightly sprints on this group, so I love that last piece of advice, quite frankly. And I don't know what time they're going to be starting tonight, but I'd suggest that you all get together and do them in an hour from now, so you'll have time for a little bit of a rest before you write your next scene. Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on. It's really been a huge pleasure. I do want to put a plug in for his website. He mentioned that he has some samples of novel pitches and comic book pitches and a lot of things. Yeah. And so go onto his website at jonathanmayberry.com, I think it is, and you'll find that under the free stuff for writers. Just want to check on that. Okay. Thank you all very much for being here, and happy writing. We'll talk to you later.
Thanks for inviting me in. I really appreciate it. This was great.
Okay. We love having you. Thank you.
Take care, guys.
Bye-bye. Hi, Spencer.
Hey,